Hello and welcome to Eth201, Business Ethics and Corporate Social Responsibility. This is Lecture 3 in Week 4. We're covering Module 3, The Nature of Capitalism. This is the first part of the lecture, and in the first part of the lecture I'm going to introduce the overall module, and then I'm going to talk about the first two objectives. After that, I'd like you to watch the video, The Changing Nature of Capitalism, before we move on to talking about some of the other objectives. So, this again comes from the textbook, and these slides are supported by the resources from the textbook. Chapter 3. So, on successful completion of this module, this is what you should be able to do as students. You should be able to define capitalism and identify 4 key features of a capitalist economic system. To understand the moral justifications of capitalism as an acceptable system. To understand some of the different perspectives on economic distribution as part of considering the moral implications of an economic system. And as I said, in this part 1, I'm going to talk about Objective 1 and 2. Then we're going to move on to talk about the theoretical and operational criticisms of capitalism, understanding the key features and criticisms of socialism, which is a competing economic system, or an alternate economic system, and finally understand some of the key contemporary socio-economic challenges facing Western capitalist society. So let's get on with it. Objective 1. Define capitalism and identify 4 key features of a capitalist economic system. So let's first define capitalism. Capitalism is an economic system in which the major portion of production and distribution is in private hands, operating in what is termed a profit or market system. I want to emphasize that capitalism can include aspects of a political mixed economy as well. So in Australia, most manufacturing firms, most companies are privately owned, but there's also government expenditure in other areas. But we live in a capitalist system in Australia. We are probably a mixed economy ultimately, rather than purely a capitalist system. Capitalist systems do not have a central government that dictates how much of anything will be produced. So the history of capitalism is it was initially built on the idea that there were trades of people or guilds of people with similar skills that could set prices and control those skills and then offer those skills to others. Mercantile capitalism evolved from mutual dependence between the state, the government, and commercial interests. The evolution of mercantile capitalism includes things like the British East India Company, where you had effectively a private body expanding the empire, the British East India Company, in a relationship with the British government. And as those areas expanded, you had a balance between what was being provided by the state and what was being provided by the private company. And there was some mixes and some overlaps between the two. Financial capitalism is things like pools and trusts and holding companies, banking and insurance and industrial interests all overlapping to represent financial organizations. And global capitalism is things like currency and stock exchanges and different competing economic forces from different countries, all bound together by the single international trading system. So that's the heavy definitional part of our discussion of capitalism. Let's look at the 4 key features that we have to remember before we look and start discussing other areas of ethics and capitalism. A key feature of capitalism, it has companies. Companies have the legal stature of individual persons. They're able to enjoy many of the rights and entitlements that a person has. If we look at the US with companies, companies can, in fact, donate money to political parties because they have the same freedom of speech under the Constitution as an individual does. They are entities, so their owners may, through the use of limited liability, protect themselves from the performance of the company. They're a separate entity. The second feature of capitalism is the notion of profit, the profit motive. It's based on the assumption that human beings are economic creatures who recognise and are motivated by their own self-interest. The people will always attempt to put their own benefit above the benefit of broader society or the groups they are part of. Economic self-interest means that you put yourself first economically. So you're always striving to gain the most economically, most income, most finance, both benefit economically, most economic benefit. I could have said that a little bit more clearly, but it is a live lecture. The third feature of capitalism is competition. Competition means that firms compete for each other in an open market and enables people or companies or other companies to choose who supplies them. The benefit of competition, if it's open competition, under a capitalist model, is that it prevents prices from escalating in a way that it may escalate if there's a monopoly control of a particular item. And finally, private property. Private property requires private ownership of major means of production and distribution. So it should be legal to own property and intellectual property and manufacturing, the use of raw materials, the use of resources. They shouldn't be controlled by a government and only available to the government. Controlled by the government in a way that makes them only available to the government. So that's our 4 features of capitalism. Let's now look at the moral justifications of capitalism. The arguments for capitalism are that we have a natural right to property, and drawing on Adam Smith, which I know you've dealt with in other topics, other units, the invisible hand of the market. That the greatest benefit comes from the market. The argument against capitalism is that there are moral limits on how much worth people have and how much wealth people can amass. Now, these moral limits are designed to argue that in society, people need to benefit as a member of society. The issue comes about when wealth creates wealth without the need for labour, because the people, don't benefit. This is where you find people talking about the top 1% of the US, the top 1% of an economy owning 80% of the means of production, owning 80% of the wealth. The imbalance that occurs means that people can't work, people can't benefit at the same rate for the work and contribution they're making to the economy. and you get inequities that arise. So the theory of capitalism rests on the view that human beings are rational economic creatures who are naturally competitive and naturally motivated by self-interest. But clearly people aren't always motivated by self-interest, and that's one of the key criticisms. People are quite often put other benefits ahead of economic benefits in a society. They'll make choices that aren't rationally economic. I'll buy an expensive car rather than feeding their children. And how does a social safety net, how do things like health and education fit within the capitalist model? And you see people, particularly on the right wing of the political spectrum in America, the only country that doesn't have universal health coverage, saying, well, health isn't a right. Health care is something that you need to pay for. Education should be something that you need to pay for. If you've got more money, you should be able to pay for the right education. It's not fair that we've got some people paying $25,000 for a private school and they're still paying tax to send poorer people to public schools. That's not fair. We should get a voucher to cover the equivalent cost of what we're spending on, we would have paid in tax for the public school, so that we can put that towards our private school income, our private school fees. So the problem with capitalism and the economic perspective of capitalism and self-interest is that, again, it can lead to inequities, but again, it may in fact not include what really and fully motivates people, because people are more than just rational economic creatures. Okay, so what I want you to do now is watch the video, The Changing Nature of Capitalism. And then after you've watched that video, we'll come back and do part 2 of the lecture, which looks at perspectives on capitalism and objective 3 and 4.